to your life.
Hey everyone, Susan Smith here. This time I'm coming to you not from my studio, but from the quilt show floor. So I am at the TriCity Quilters Guild annual show, and it is in Kennewick, Washington. And this is day one of a 2-day show. So, things have changed. You guys who follow my live and unscripted episodes know that they're really truly unscripted. Stuff really happens. So today what has happened is we've had some real difficulty with the cameras and being able to pull everything together for the demo that I had planned to do. So instead, I thought we would come on and give you a brief tour of my quilts that are hanging at the show. Many of you saw my little reel, a 20-second, buzzing through all the quilts that are going to be in the show, and we're like, wait, pause, let me see them a little longer. So today will be your chance for that. So I'm just going to chat for a minute and give a few people time to join. Again, technical difficulties. We weren't able to join the same scheduled live that we had because we're doing it we're streaming in a different way, and I won't give you all the details. But I'm just going to chat for a minute about the show as a whole and the process, and then we'll get to walking around the quilts. I think I have 16 quilts and projects. So it'll take a few minutes, but we'll have a good look at them and give you a chance. If you want to type in questions, you certainly can. So once again, I'm in Kennewick, Washington, at the TriCity Quilters Guild annual quilt show. I am the featured quilter, and I'm sharing the front of the hall with a local featured quilter as well. And she's sharing work in her area from 1994 onwards. And so we've got almost 30 years of work represented for her. So I feel like a newcomer, a new kid on the block, So, but it's really fun to be sharing the front of the hall with her. So she has one display and I have the twin display. So I'm going to take, I don't know how long it will take exactly, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, maybe 20, and walk you around my display and talk a little bit about the quilts. They each do have a story, so I've taken the time for the purposes of the show to type up their stories and hang them with each quilt so that people can enjoy them, even if I'm not there to tell the stories. And to me, that is a huge part of quilting, is the story. It's maybe where you found the fabric, or what you were doing when you had the right idea for that quilt, or how the idea for quilting came to you, or any number of things. So quilts always have stories. So are we ready to start, Mr. Producer, sir?
Whenever you want.
He's on the other side of the camera. Okay, we're going to start with one of my all-time favorite quilts.
They can't hear any of that. They couldn't hear any of that, so go ahead, re-say that.
So I'm going to start with one of my favorite quilts. This is Audrey, and I'll get in front of it so that you can see it and hopefully hear me as well. I'll stand a bit closer to the camera so that you can hear me. Audrey was from a challenge in my local machine quilting guild, and it is a vintage quilt top. I always name my quilt, so we'll talk about it as her, because it's Audrey. Audrey was a vintage quilt top, very stained, very kind of misshapen, and it was my job to take that raw material and make it into a beautiful quilt. Mr. Producer can maybe pan slightly over my storyboard. This was part of our process of producing the treasure quilts, was to show what we began with, show what some of the steps that we took were, and then of course show the finished result. So that's Audrey, and it's a number of years now since I did Audrey, and she still remains one of my favorite quilts of all time, and I think always will. Something about that classic double wedding ring, something about the process of when I quilted it, thinking about all the fabrics that went into it, little boys' shirt pieces and grandma's apron and all those things. So that was Audrey. Okay, next up, well, I'll stand in front of Audrey. Mr. Producer's like directing me with his arms, right? So I'm just trying to pay attention here. Okay, next. This was another vintage treasure here, and this one is named Ava. And Ava came to me just as a series of blocks, unfinished blocks. They were still on the foundation newspaper pieces that they had been sewn on originally. And they had ads for like suits in 1952 for $6.97. And my real treasure is the backs of one of them was a byline by Eleanor Roosevelt. So I have preserved that one. So that's another story that's hidden in this quilt. So just receiving that limited number of blocks, what you see here on the quilt is all the blocks I had. It was my job then to design something that I thought showcased the blocks. And for my purposes, I really wanted this to feature the quilting, so I got intricate and detailed with it and kind of went crazy.
Share, subscribe, and share so those who missed the link.
So This is Ava. As we move on to the next quilt, be sure to like and subscribe and share this with some of your friends that you think might be interested in going along on this virtual tour. I know the sound is difficult because we're moving closer and further from the camera. I'll speak up as best I can, but it gives you an opportunity to view the quilts actually live and pretend like you're attending the quilt show.
Reasons why we're here a few times.
So once again, I'm at the TriCity Quilters Guild Show, and our intention was to do a live and unscripted and actual quilting project today on air, and that just did not come together. So this little tour of my quilts is what you're getting instead. So I have one more vintage quilt to show you in this sequence. And this one, if you follow me on Instagram, you've been seeing over the last week. This is a vintage Lone Star. So the whole top came to me completed and I quilted it. So if you don't already follow me on Instagram, you should. Over the last week, I posted a couple of reels kind of showing the progress of the quilt and some of my thought processes, why I was doing what I was doing throughout that week. So you can go back and view those at any time. This is quilted. You can see the high definition of the quilting. And it was done with a double bat. So there's an 80-20 batting on the bottom and a fluffy wool batting on the top. And that makes all of the quilting really stand out in relief. And there was also a lot of excess fabric and funky stuff going on, which happens with vintage things. So I just quilted it into submission. And when it's all said and done, it's gorgeous. All right. Okay, moving on. This little gem is called, appropriately enough, Sundress. And the pattern is not original to me. It's by Meg Hockey of Crabapple Hill. And I used the exact colors that she recommended because they're so gorgeous and I absolutely love them. So each embroidered square is a hand-embroidered sundress. And then in the center, can you read it on camera? The most important thing in a dress is the woman wearing it. Pretty sure that sentiment is why I bought the quilt pattern in the first place. But anyway, loving the colors of the embroidery that Meg recommended, I found this gorgeous fabric that I used as the borders, and it was kind of my jumping off place to then, you know, root around in my bits of fabric and find all the little things that coordinated with those kind of celery greens and corals and golds. And that's how that quilt grew. Turning a corner, we need a big look at this one. This one I call Birds of a Feather. And this one is an original design. The idea came to me one day. I love flying geese. It's a very traditional block in quilting. But the idea of using scraps to create these ombre flying geese. So starting with the charcoal, almost black in the very bottom, you know, going through purples and burgundies and reds and all the way up to the softer coral at the top. This quilt is 100% out of my scrap bins. And of course, because birds of a feather do flock together, I had to put in these tiny geese in various places on the quilt. They're joining the flock, and maybe Mr. Producer can focus on the one little renegade in the upper northeast corner. He's doing his own thing up there. But he wanted to be part of the story, so. And then this one, kind of a point of interest. This is not custom quilted, this is edge to edge. So I've quilted the same kind of swirly, windy look design across the whole thing. To me, that represented the geese and their flight and did not detract at all from the color, which is really the focus of this quilt. So that is Birds of a Feather. Moving down the corner, want a big picture look at this one too. So this one I call Ferris wheel. It is also my own original design, and the idea for this quilt came to me right about the time that Pantone had announced their 2019 color of the year, which was Living Coral. Coral is a color I love. So again, I went through my scraps and my bits and my fabric stash, and I came up with everything that I thought played into that Living Coral color story. So that's how this quilt was born. So this was my original prototype of this pattern design idea that I had. But in fact, there's about 1,200 pieces in this quilt, so I thought that's probably not the most practical thing for a pattern that I want to publish. So I kind of switched gears and went back to the draft board and designed it in a two-color way, enabling me to use larger blocks and components and make a much faster piecing project. So I'll come closer to the mic again so you can hear it. But can you see, maybe Mr. Producer will go back and forth between the two quilts. They are in fact the same pattern. There's just fewer seams in the one. So it was a fun exercise in the really different effect that you get in doing that way. And on this two-color one then too, I took the opportunity, because it is solid colors and does show up in the quilting, to do some custom quilting that kind of echoes the piecing, really plays it up, really makes a statement. And this one was published in a magazine on BC Quilt Maker, January, February 2020. This one was published. So that was the evolution of that pattern. This next wall that we're going to look at has a few quilts on it. And I think we'll do the edge ones here first, the small ones. So these two, again, were original projects. I've never published a pattern for them, but I saw a photograph that had this idea of a positive negative image that got me thinking. And so I made this quilt in honor of my husband's 50th birthday. He's a musician, a lot of music in our family over the last 30 odd years, so it was fun to kind of celebrate that in this musical quilt. So these blue scraps, they're very much cobbled together in a crazy quilt kind of way, but they're things like, you know, the kids' PJs or little doll clothes pieces, a lot of nostalgic fabrics in those blue scraps. So use that positive negative image, and then of course played up that whole theme with the quilting as well. So the piano keyboard that scrolls down here, there's a bass clef hidden down here. There's even strings on the guitar quilted into it. I don't all that often make things that are 100% creative and improv, so that was a fun exercise for me. And of course, after that one was done, I thought, now what else can I do a positive negative image with? Of course, you need a kind of uncomplicated outline to do it with. So I chose a Granny Smith apple. And a few things I did differently on this one. The scrappy portion on this one is all strips. The whole width of that green area. So they're not crazy quilt style, they're all strips. But again, the positive negative image, and I did the applique of the over top layer actually on the long arm. And it's much like a blanket stitch. It's not too complicated, but again, it was fun to see how far I could go with it. So I did both the leaf and the apple in that way. And then if you want to look at a close-up of the quilting, I took the opportunity, because these are all stripes, to quilt something different in each line. And this one down here says an apple a day. And way down in the corner there's a little worm in the apple. I'll move it around a bit so the light catches him. Little guy. And then this area over here was a fun quilting exercise too. I kind of mapped out, it's like the piecing of a quilt. So I mapped that all out, and then I did all this quilting freehand, proving that long arms like to move in straight lines. So that was fun. This quilt is not my own pattern. It's by Krista Moser, and it's called Bumblebee Blossoms. But this is one of my favorite quilts that I've ever made, and I think it's because of the fabric. It's Ombre. I'm trying to remember the title of it. It might have been Blossoms too, because it's got little tiny white flowers sprinkled in it. But the colors are so rich, and the fact that you can use one color in two ways. Let me find an example here. See how this flower is dark on the outside and light on the inside? This flower down here is the same fabric, but light on the outside and dark on the inside. So you get this sparkly, wonderful variety of color. And really, truly, it just sparkles without having a whole broad range of fabrics. And then, of course, for my quilting, I just did simple straight line because I wanted those flowers and fabric colors to be the stars of the show. Well, the bumblebees are kind of the stars too, let's be honest. So dang cute. The next quilt, this one again, I'm trying to illustrate how beautiful edge-to-edge quilting really can be. So this is another pattern by Vanessa Christensen with her Ombre fabrics, and she published this pattern as well. and I remember what it's called, Christmas something. Sorry about that. And I used a like a shot cotton in the background, so it's a woven charcoaly fabric. It's a, Mr. Producer's going to try and zoom in on it. It's just got some depth. It's a bit tweedy looking. Anyway, gorgeous fabric. But when I had the quilt all pieced, of course I'm thinking, well, what am I going to quilt on this now? And my first reaction is, well, I've got to custom quilt it. The trees, the stars, all that negative space. But then when I thought about it for a minute, I thought, you know, I really could highlight how beautiful texture and overall quilting design can provide. It's not fussy, it's not time consuming, but I knew this was going to be a quilt that was used on our couch by our family, and I didn't want it to be so special we were afraid to use it, right? So I went with the edge to edge, and I've not been sorry. I just think that is an overall gorgeous look. You still see the trees, see the stars, and that texture is just a lovely backdrop. Let me know if you agree. And by the way, there is still time to share this with your friends if you think some of them would like to see this too. But like and subscribe for sure if you're enjoying this show. Okay, next up is another vintage quilt. And this one, you can see in the picture up here, came to me as a tumbling blocks quilt. And there were hardly any full pieces that were intact in it, like full blocks. So I actually took the diamonds out and reassembled them into what you see here. So there are a few tumbling blocks, and there are a number of just individual diamonds that I added. And this was just my own design, my own idea of how to display these beautiful vintage fabrics. In addition, I was able, in my stashes are good for a lot of things, I had some vintage linens, so all the white background is made from a variety of vintage linens. Some were tablecloths, some were, you know, dresser scarf type things, and they're different fabrics. So one of them is kind of a damask, one of them is very linen-y looking, and slightly different shades of white. So I just cut them into 8-inch squares, you know, avoiding the stained portions of those linens, and pieced those 8-inch squares together, and then appliqued my tumbling blocks on. And I used a little bit different technique on this. I actually reverse appliqued. So I laid the diamonds on the back side of my white fabric, cut the white fabric from in front of it, and then buttonhole stitch with my long arm onto it. And I did that because all these fabrics were so very fragile that I didn't think they would stand up to a turned edge type of applique. They were just too fragile. So this is a quilt that is only for display. Very fragile fabrics in it, although they've now been stitched down pretty securely. And I had fun quilting some feathers and other random things on that. So that's Radiant. You have to tweak the signs as we go around. Another flying geese quilt, and I call this one True North. Flying geese. So I call this one True North, and this one was kind of a quilting sampler, if there is such a thing. I know we piece samplers a lot of times, but in this case, I quilted the sampler. So I had been to some classes with other teachers of long arm quilting, and I had all these ideas and some new rulers and all these ideas rolling around in my head, and I wanted to try them all out, but I can't make that many quilts, right? So my idea with this one was I took this very simple jelly roll of a rainbow of colors. I believe they were Robert Kaufman. I had had them for years and years. Pieced a pretty simple quilt with just this one column of flying geese, and then did my quilting sampler. So there's all kinds of different quilting on this, and we'll do a couple of close-ups for you so you can see some of the details. I was just trying things out. So you can see that there's a small fill in here. There's some geometric work going on up here. Some ruler work within the geese, highlighting different things, and more ruler work coming down this way. And again, you know, playing a little bit with the show of light, with areas that are quilted densely and areas that are not. Down here, I was using a ruler that had an inner and an outer circle marking, and then basically you just scribble to fill that in. And it's a really fun effect. But this is my favorite. We'll see if we can get the light to catch it. This area right here, I quilted in individual blocks, and on half of the block I did 1/8-inch lines, and on the other half I did 1/4-inch lines. But when you view it from different angles, you see a star. Can you see that here? I'm not sure how this shows up in the lighting that you're seeing on camera. But I loved that effect. Here's another star. Isn't that pretty? And that's all done with straight lines. It just has to do with the spacing of them. So that was my sampler quilting quilt, and I call it True North. The next quilt is very much an experiment in quilting as well. I call this Hoot Nanny. It's a whole crowd of owls. There are 8 owls arranged around it, much like the hands of a clock or the spokes of a wheel. They're all facing, they're all radiating out from the center. So there are 8 of them. They're all different. Get a couple close-ups. Their faces, like their expressions are different. When I was quilting them, I gave them all nicknames. There was the Midnight Owl, and there was the Jowly Owl, and the Scowly Owl. It was a lot of fun. So this was just, I had seen some pictorial quilting and thought, I wonder if I can do that. And so this was my exploration. And I should mention too, a lot of these textures that are outside the bow are courtesy of Beth Ann Nemish. I have her book of A to Zen textures, and a lot of my ideas came from that. So I love all of those. And then in the center, I hung a moon, and there's kind of some 3D embroidery and little beads hanging. The owls are kind of, you know, out at night. So that was how I showed the nighttime. Okay, let us maybe take a minute and look at this little coat before we do the last 2 quilts. I'm going to turn this around for you guys to see. I call this coat Little Miss Scarlet. And it was made from a pattern. It's in a plastic bag here. This was my mother's vintage McCall's pattern, 1954. And I used this original pattern to make the quilt. So first off, I quilted yards of this red fabric with just muslin backing. And then I proceeded to cut that up as though it were the outside fabric of a coat. Lined it, used traditional methods to make the coat. Isn't that lining just the last word? So of course now the next thing is I have to make a coat large enough for me, because this is a child's coat, sadly. But that's the size my mom's pattern was, so that's the size I made it. But Little Miss Scarlet has traveled all across the U.S. and brought home a few ribbons. Fun project. Okay, a couple more big quilts. The one you're looking at here,
What's behind
if
you
you've
for
watched
last?
the last week or 2 of my live and unscripted episode, it's been behind me on the show. And I call it Starstruck. It's my own pattern, and this is the golden version. I made several versions of it. Starstruck, the golden version, has very detailed quilting, as you can see. So I initially released this as a pattern that was a block of the month. So each row was a month-long project, and each row features a different kind of star. They are traditional star blocks with maybe a little modification, but each one has different techniques, like working with Tri-Rex rulers, or working with tiny half-square triangles, or working with bias edges, or specialty trimming. I'm trying to think of all the techniques that were in it. So I have since compiled it all into a full-fledged pattern that comes all at once together. So you can find that in my Etsy shop if you're interested in it. My Etsy shop is Stitched by Susan 2015, and the pattern is called Starstruck. But this particular version uses Paintbrush Studios' Yarrow color as the background, and it is in real life, it is just a stunning golden yarrow color. And then all the prints are Allison Glass fabrics. I love Allison's rich and vibrant colors, and they play really well with that golden background. And then finally, another of my all-time favorite quilts. Many of you will recognize this pattern. It's Tula Pinks, and the print fabrics in it are Tula Pink as well. So I bought this as a kit, and when it came to me, all the printed fabrics were quarter yard by width of fabric pieces, and there were 40 of them. So there was a pattern, but there was no indication of what fabrics to use where. So that was entirely up to me. So everyone who bought that kit got a different result depending on how they cut up their fabrics. The fun thing about this quilt is it's really a sampler. There's just different types of blocks in it. So it's just a very contemporary sampler style quilt. Absolutely stunning results. And I'll let Mr. Producer zoom in on a bit of the quilting. You know, again, I had been to a class, I had some ideas in my head, and this seemed like a great place to get some of those ideas out onto fabric with needle and thread. So it was really, really fun, and this remains one of my favorite quilts of all time.
So we're 5 minutes minutes away from your demo. Do you want to keep on going with your demo? And they're asking for close-ups of the quilt.
Okay, I'm just going to chat with Mr. Producer, see if there are any questions that I need to be answering. I'll stand in front of the butterfly so you can keep looking at it.
I want a close-up of the quilt, of the coat.
Of the coat. Okay, close up of the coat folks are asking for. So let me turn it around. Have a look at the quilting first. And I used a cotton spandex blend, so it's mostly cotton, but I think it was 3% spandex for the fabric. And I put little velvet pocket flaps on it, velvet covered buttons, and a little black velvet collar. Before I was a quilter, I was a garment maker, and so this just was, you know, a nod back to that time in my life. I was used to lining things and setting in sleeves and all that sort of thing, and I don't do it so much anymore. It was really enjoyable to make that coat. Okay, have we any other questions we should address?
Yeah.
All right, folks, that's been our tour. I've got some people standing around me now waiting for a demo of some quilting, so I'm going to get on and do that. Thank you so much for joining me. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed seeing this and enjoyed this little snapshot look at some of my quilts. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you next time.